Hello. My name's Karen Quinlan. I'm the CEO of Arts Centre Melbourne, and we are delighted to be the host of this venue for this very special event. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we stand, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, and pay respect to their elders past and present, and to any First Peoples here today. This site, by the banks of the Birrarung, has been a place for song, storytelling, community and culture for First Nations people for millennia. As Victoria's Arts Centre, we consider it a privilege to be located on Wurundjeri country, which always was and always will be Aboriginal land, of which sovereignty has never been ceded. As one of the project partners in Australia's largest cultural infrastructure project, the Melbourne Arts Precinct Transformation, we welcome you to the Theatres building, which is now partly a building site, as early works are well underway with major works commencing shortly. This is a project that will change the face of Melbourne, and I would like to acknowledge representatives from MAPCO, which is spearheading the project's delivery, and partners from Development Victoria, the NGV, Creative Victoria, our respective design teams, and the Victorian Government, which is funding the project. I know you are eagerly waiting to hear from our guests on stage, hot off the plane from London, so allow me to introduce our host for this evening, John Hazelwood, Principal and Design Director from Hassell, the design team on the Melbourne Arts Precinct Public Realm. Enjoy.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. The interest and the almost instant sellout of this evening clearly demonstrates an appetite for our city's landscapes and our streets and our spaces, as well as our gardens, to be living things that are driven by change and by spontaneity, that are biodiverse, that are filled with beauty, that creates delight, and not monocultures that are clipped and tortured and mown and kept in stasis. As Karen said, we're joined tonight, and I will let them speak in a moment, by James Hitchmough and Nigel Dunnett, along with Emma Cutting, who is the founder of the Heart Gardening Project and the Melbourne Pollinator Corridor, as well as Bree Trevena, who is the Senior Manager for Public Realm Precinct at Melbourne Arts Precinct Corporation. So what's going to happen is you have to listen to me for about 5 minutes, and then we'll let James and Nigel talk for, well, 15 to 20, we'll see how we go, and then a panel discussion that lets everyone else have a chat, and then we will hand over questions to the audience as well. I'm pretty sure it's probably going to overrun the advertised time, so we won't be upset if anybody leaves. We won't get upset. Okay, my name is, as Karen said, John Hazelwood. I'm a principal at the design practice Hassell. I'm a landscape architect and a gardener. And over the past few years, with my colleague, Ben Duckworth, who's here somewhere, and the team at Hassell, along with our design collaborators, Soil from New York, along with James and Nigel as well, we've been leading the design for the public realm associated with the Melbourne Arts Precinct. And as Karen said, it's a once-in-a-generational project to transform Australia's primary cultural precinct that includes the new NGV Contemporary and the redevelopment of the Arts Centre, and all stitched together by around 18,000 square metres of gardens. What have we got? That's the wrong picture. Okay, there we go. That's the one. That was my garden. That was my introduction. Very early on in the life of the project, we were convinced that a public landscape of this scale has the opportunity to be more than a contemporary landscape of art and performance, but also can be a place that demonstrates the power of nature and the power of diversity and biodiversity, and how it can connect into wider ecological stories and cultural stories. A place where the planting can sing, it can dance, and it's a reason to visit and return again and again, a new place for Melbourne. Across the globe, planting design has changed dramatically over the past few years. It's being led by naturalistic plant designers such as Thomas Rayner and Claudio West in the US, of course Pete Oldhoff in Europe, And in the UK, Professors James Hitchmough and Nigel Dunnett, who lead what has become known as the Sheffield School of Planting Design. Their high profile has shone a light on an often forgotten part of public landscapes, the understory. It's so often an afterthought, is often driven by a limited plant availability, by limited maintenance expertise, and if I'm honest with myself, designers' lack of plant knowledge and a lack of a desire to experiment. It's so often a missed opportunity to create beautiful, rich, and biodiverse urban spaces. A number of years ago, when we first started talking about and researching and practicing a nature-first approach to city spaces, the debate was actually around justifying this nature-first approach. Despite what on the face of it would appear relatively benign design interventions of trees and planting, a densely planted and beautiful and rich garden was often a hard sell when up against the ideas of pop-ups and activation, as well as those pragmatic constraints of maintenance and plant availability. That debate and the implementation of complex, biodiverse and beautiful planting in the city has moved on immensely in the last few years. In New South Wales, where I'm based, the government architect's connection with country guidelines has dramatically changed how designers of our urban spaces should be approaching projects, grounded in First Nations knowledge, and in particular the simple eco versus ego diagrams that place the human and the non-human on an equal footing. We've been having ongoing conversations and consultation with the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung traditional owners as we work through the design process on the Arts Precinct. Here in Melbourne, advocates such as the team at Burnley have been doing absolutely amazing work in demonstrating how complex and floristic planting work can demonstrate how it's not necessarily about high maintenance and upfront costs through their research in projects such as their Woody Meadow and their grassland projects. And of course, their rooftop garden, if anyone gets a chance to visit that. Also in Melbourne, high-profile plant-driven gardeners such as Michael McCoy and plant advocate and designer Jack Semler, who's also helping us out on the Arts Precinct project. The City of Melbourne's work on street biodiversity continues to help to provide us with lessons learned and inspiration, and we will all be watching the Green Line project as it evolves over the coming years. We at Hassell have been working closely with John Rayner and Claire Farrell at Burnley in implementing similar techniques in a Sydney context through planting trials with Sydney Metro, again showing that this richness of nature-inspired planting does not necessarily need a high-line level of maintenance and of cost. And finally, Emma Cutting's Heart Gardening project that weaves its way through South Melbourne. It's another stunning example of biodiversity positive possibilities at a grassroots and at a community level. It's a fantastic example of how tenacity and an inspirational level of positivity can cut through some of the more mundane and short-sighted reasons that nature can be such a hard thing to implement within a city. But I will shut up now. We're here to hear James and Nigel. I can't stress how much their work has directly changed how I, as a landscape architect, now practice. Spending time with them both, here and in the UK, has always provided a fresh inspiration and a desire to experiment and push myself harder in terms of what can be achieved. Firstly, we'll hear from James. I know he's just moved, but spending time in his past garden in Sheffield was always a pure joy, despite the often heavy jet lag that they're both now feeling today. The layering and the sheer number of species you can squeeze into that small space was always stunning and inspirational. Plus, James' local connections to Melbourne and his knowledge through his time teaching at Burnley have been absolutely invaluable on the project. Also, his experience at working at different scales. You know, we often think of these naturalistic planting approaches being at small scale and small interventions within the city. But his work, particularly in China, is dealing with much larger scales, dealing with forest, woodlands, and as green infrastructure on potentially massive scales. So I'm going to hand over now to James and let you speak.
Give me a call after 18 minutes. 18 minutes, yeah, okay. Good, well, thanks very much, everybody. John talked about experimenting, and of course, I think it's fair to say that both Nigel and I, we've spent a lot of our professional lives experimenting as academics, and we've had the luxury to design vegetation and then to run it as real-life experiments and for many years to see if it actually works. And that's what you have on the screen there. That's a living laboratory of change. And it's much more elegant to learn how disastrous things are, behind the scenes, and to do it in the real world type thing. So that's been quite useful. And that's actually a serious point, because one of the reasons why as landscape architects we're not always as experimental as we might like is because we fear failure. And having this chance to have this behind the scenes has been really, really useful to us. I have form here. Some of you are quite young, but I used to live here. And so I came here in 1983, and I fiddled around and did lots of bits and pieces, and I left in 1993. And I sort of rematerialized in 2015, because it was sort of me who really conceptualized the ideas on the woody meadow. And so, although John and Claire have been the people pushing it forward, so I popped out the ether again for that type thing. So I've had a long-term relationship with Australia. The thing that really drives me in terms of my design practice and my thinking about design is very much looking at the natural world as a source of inspiration. And the natural world's not always beautiful. Sometimes a lot of the natural world can be quite mundane. But if you ever drive with me in a car, on a road, I stop about every 500 meters, and there's a screeching of brakes, and everyone rolls their eyes in the car, and I jump out. And I was in Western Australia a few weeks ago, and I just went past that, and I just thought, what an incredible thing. And nature for me is not just being an aesthetic stimulus, because one of the ways I've used it to actually, if you like, try and learn the rules about what makes those scenes really beautiful, and how can you then resynthesize those things and actually make landscapes which have some of the similar qualities. But it's also fantastic because it lets you understand the limits of plants. So, the melaleucas grow in the water. Whoops. Faux pas. I am very old. Let's just move on. You must have thought he's lost his marbles for a second there, Sorry. So there we go. So you know that the Calathamnus is not found in the water, the Melaleuca is. And that sort of understanding, that primary understanding of plant distribution is really, really important to what we do. I stood on that roadside on the Western Highway in 1984, and I looked at that scene, and that's a fragment of a lost landscape of Western Plains, Themata grassland. And I had three competing ideas going through my head. The first thing is I was looking at this as a lost landscape and thinking what a loss of a bit of evolutionary history of that landscape through intensive sheep grazing. So there's a sense of loss and sadness. The second thing I was thinking was, be really interesting to know how to make that, to be able to restore it on roadsides, perhaps in some public parks. And then the third and most seditious idea was it would also be really interesting to take elements of that as a frame and then perhaps to add other species to that, which might not be from that system, might not even be from this continent, to create something which was a melded product, which might do things when that cannot, to stretch the season. I think when you think about semi-natural vegetation and in design, you're always thinking about the gradient of both the places the vegetation comes from and also the places you might use it in. So here we've got a native grassland in the top left, and I've got that as seemingly natural, although obviously clearly that vegetation has been curated, by First Nation peoples for thousands and thousands of years. It's much a cultural landscape as a natural landscape. And then you have what might seem like a natural meadow in Kazakhstan until a guy turns up at 5 o'clock with the scythe, and his family been managing this whole landscape on a landscape scale for thousands of years. And then you have my garden, Eklas Garden in Sheffield, and I'm the curator of this. And so we're going from seemingly natural to very unnatural. And I think one of the things you have to do as a designer when you deal with these gradients, you have to loosen up a little bit on what is appropriate where. Because as you move to the more natural, you know, there might be things that you should be thinking about which are not present in this first landscape. So, for example, in my garden at Sheffield, that's Themida triandra, the grass. In between the tussocks, you know, there are nerines and South African gladiolus. And I do that because I get flowers in autumn when the system that Themida triandra comes from doesn't have those. Okay? So this resynthesis is really, really interesting. And I'm very interested in these melded ideas. But I asked the question at the end, is that okay? And of course, the thing is, you know, there are no truths in the world. There are simply positions. And, you know, we all have a worldview or a position, and it's driven by a whole range of things. And I think all you can do when you work in this area, you can simply accept, you know, that you have a view, perhaps other people have a different view. And there are many publics. There can never be a complete consensus about what is right or not. So coming back to the idea of looking at native vegetation in the wild, you know, seeing things like this is in Kazakhstan, and then, you know, often what I try to do is sometimes try to synthesize things out of this. So here in the same, some of the similar visual ideas applied to a new public sort of park space in Beijing. And tied in with these things, you know, one of the drivers is always, you know, what's the threshold of drama and perhaps color for public engagement. So why is that woman taking a picture of that? Part of my research has been in environmental psychology, part of it has been, my academic research has been in what you might call ecology and design. So these are important questions for me. Now, one of the other things that's really important about this sort of vegetation is this, from an ecological point of view, the vegetation I work with, be it in nature or be it the stuff I design, it's essentially got a sort of mechanical clockwork, and one needs to understand how it works, because what's it going to do? So there's a need to be able to see it as a complex, changing thing, just like a watch. And so some of the things I'm interested in doing is understanding more about how aspects of what the plants do. And I'm just illustrating this with some examples from Australian plants from my recent trip to Western Australia. So here's a problem that you have in many landscapes. You have shade. And this is a really difficult problem to resolve often with Australian native species from a sclerophyllous environment, because shade tolerance is rarely present in many species. But here's a species which can actually do shade really well. So, you know, finding these sorts of plants is obviously a really key idea to actually make things sustainable and visually successful in the longer term. And simply recognizing the limitations of sometimes the flora you have access to. So here's regeneration and immortality. And another characteristic in the native flora is only about sort of 40–50% of native species in Australia resprout after fire, i.e. can be pruned very severely. And this is one of them. This is Grevillea wilsonii, and you can see the blackened stem. Now, plants that can do this essentially are immortal and can be coppiced and made to regrow for over and over again. So it builds in a fantastic level of resilience, which you might not otherwise have. And the same with Daisy Mala terminalis. Hey, there's the evidence. The blackened stumps with the shoots coming off. So this is real. This is what the woody meadow was all about. It's about utilizing these traits. And then there are visual traits, things like, you know, shape and form, and how do you get, you know, so this idea of this emergent form. In the Northern Hemisphere, we use the carrot family a lot for these flat horizontal lines and these erect stems. But in a more drier environment, such as Australia, you start looking at some of these conospermums, which have exactly the same, in a woody sense, exactly the same sort of architecture. So again, designers, you know, trying to get nurseries to use plants which have traits which designers want to use, rather than everything being a bun. You know, the bun is a great thing, but the bun is only one game in town. And then when you want to make sort of vegetation like this, very often to have a lot of complexity, you have to have space at certain times of the year. And as you have on the second image here, this is the same place. And so we've developed in the UK this technique of planting into deep mineral gravel mulches. And this maintains deliberately a very dry surface and almost switches off weed colonization. So we've tried to bring all of these things together in terms of the process of making this sort of complex planting sustainable and doable in urban landscapes. Now, I think the critical thing is, I put these two contrasting images in because one deals mostly with 2 dimensions of spatial organization, and Kasparov, in terms of what he's doing, he's dealing with 4 dimensions because he's dealing with 3 dimensions, but we need to deal with 4 dimensions. We need to deal with space this way, that way, and also time. And so what Kasparov is doing there, he's actually strategizing. He's thinking about future events. Now, when I design, I need to think about what plants will do and how they will interact with one another into a distant future and try to factor that into the design. That's what I mean by strategizing, and hopefully this is one of the things we bring. And then we have representation. So, when you're doing this, planting design is often expressed in, I'm too old to be digital, so I use crayons. I'm a bit like Uldorf, we both have a box of crayons type thing, And so you can do it like this, or another way you can do it, and sometimes when you're dealing with complexity, you can't use planting plans. You can, but no one can follow them. People turn them upside, the contractor does that, and doesn't really get it. So something I've evolved, and sort of Nigel uses too, is we sometimes use an Excel spreadsheet. And what we do is we use, for the given number of planting spaces that are on a landscape, we allocate a percentage of those spaces to a given species, depending on its size and its ecological behavior. Okay, now it's just the same, just a different way of doing that. And so that landscape there, that's vegetation at London Olympic Park that I designed. It's made through that spreadsheet. And the plants are planted at random. That's how we do it. Okay, so a very different way. Okay, so we do those sort of things. And of course, with diversity and with complexity, one of the things we want to try and do is we want to try to use that complexity in a large number of species. This is my garden in Sheffield. I photographed this garden when I lived there. This is an act of obsession. Every 2 weeks from 30 fixed points. So you can begin to see and understand the patterns of spatial change through time. So I can strategize. You get it? And so this is the same space from spring to October. That's till June. And that's till October. So it goes from the first one to that. And that's driven through having all these actors doing their thing in 3 different layers. Okay? So hopefully you can begin to see how these things work. Now, of course, if you look at natural vegetation, you have really exactly the same hidden processes going on. You have these layer structures. You have this very high level of complexity. This slide was really to say, well, what makes vegetation good for animal biodiversity? Now, I haven't talked explicitly today about biodiversity nor about climate change, not because those things aren't central to what I do. In fact, they're absolutely central. In fact, they're so central, I haven't mentioned them because they are simply woven through the fabric of my thoughts. And so to bolt it on, that would be weird. So what really, what we know increasingly about what drives animal biodiversity is very, in many cases, firstly, structural complexity in space. How many layers, how complex. Which is why mown grass and trees has a very small number of birds associated with it. And if you add a layer beneath that, you'll immediately get a whole range of native birds which you do not get. It's a spatial thing as well as a resource thing. And so complexity is attractive to people like Nigel and I because it drives biodiversity. Simply by making things more complex, you will increase biodiversity with exactly the same species. And the literature shows this very clearly. So, and at larger scales, I mean, that's not massive, it's a few thousand square meters, but this is the sort of thing, you know, where we're talking about at larger scales, you know, and this landscape, I took that picture 10 years ago, that vegetation is still there, it still looks good, it's still delivering a lot of ecosystem services, etc. So, in terms of here, you know, one of the things we can often do is often when we do planting design, you often see this with native planting, but also with non-native planting too. And I really like this planting, and both of them actually, but so I'm not criticizing, I'm just really using them as an example. There's a lot of space. And what you can do is, and when I see those things, I'm really interested in using that space to try to drive, you know, more events, so putting other species into those gaps, moving away from this idea of the plant as an island, which we might meet sort of 5 years later. Like in the US, a lot of American landscapes are what we call mulch landscapes. You know, they're mostly mulch and they've got a plant every now and again, you know, type thing. I don't know why. You have to ask an American about that one. And so in the Botanic Gardens, you know, I really like Andrew Laidlaw's sort of succulent planting. I think some of these plantings are the most exciting thing that's going on in Melbourne. But I like them even more when you begin to have an ephemeral changes beneath the structure. You know, using that space to drive a whole series of seasonal events, perhaps as I showed you in my garden a minute ago. And when you move to nature, if you go to coast of Chile and you look at puya and cactus, like they're very rich puya and cactus landscapes. Puya is the spiky thing. You don't find them in splendid isolation. Between them, there are geophytes, and these are all stromarias, which are about to turn cerise pink, you know, cheek by jowl with these sorts of things. Okay, so just to finish, oops. Oh, God, hey, I'm being a good boy tonight. So I had a very shaky start, but I've got my WAP back together again, yeah? Okay, so I'm just going to show you one little project, and I've picked it because it's a really quirky, wacky project. This is as wacko as you get, really. So some of you might have read Isabel Tree's book on wilding, which is about the idea of taking land, which was previously agriculture, and turning it back into letting nature take its course, guided by some large ungulates at controlled levels, to make a sort of landscapes, this is in Britain, which look like African savanna. So this is something you should read. It should be a big issue in the Australian agricultural landscape. So rewilding. So what we did at NET is we've made a rewilding garden. This is Tom Stewart-Smith and myself. And this is the planting. This is what's known as Hitchmough's Ridge. And this is a ridge of crushed concrete and sand using deliberately very dry, hostile materials to push a community in a certain way to limit growth. And we did this because people come to do safaris at this historic estate, this Knepp estate. It's got a castle. And they also want to do a safari around a garden because they want to go back home to Surbiton and they want to think about how they can apply some of the things they can see at the scale of a typical suburban garden. So we designed this thing to try to make ecological processes which are normally invisible at a point in time evident. Okay? So it's super complex, super diverse. It's just been planted, so it all just looks a bit weird at the moment, but that's 3 months after planting. And how do we do this? I'll show you one a bit later on in a minute. So what are some of the processes in doing this from a design point of view? Well, the first thing we do, it's a series of layers. And I call these steps or layers. So the first thing is, when we design it and when we plant it, we have the biggest species, we call those dominants, and in this case, there's about one there, and about one there. They're about 1.5 metre centre. So we plant those. That's not the site. That's just a sketch plan for another project showing the same idea. So we have a lot of space and a few plants widely spaced apart. And then we do the next layer. And the next layer happens to be these tall sort of summer dormant geophytes, and they stick up, so they're pretty big. So they go in next, and they go in at 900 centres. So the space is beginning to close, yeah? And then the next one, we add the summer dormant, winter growing, didn't move. We add the next ones are the layer 3, which are the mounds, back to the mounds. I'm good with mounds, really, type thing, you know. And these go in at 600 centres. These aren't very big mounds. Okay, so we do those. And then the next thing is we do the spaces between with the ground level planting, and they're in a 400 millimetre grid. So we're creating a pyramid, if you like, and the gaps are closing and fusing. And then, I told you this is wacky, but this is more complex than we normally do, but this is just an example. And then we add some more geophytes at 200 centres, and then we sow over the top with the seed mix. Okay? So in my garden in Sheffield, John talked about, we had 250 square metres and we had 700 species in that space. So you get the gist. Now that's crazy stuff, but that's the direction of travel that you could play with. And you know, coming onto autumn, this is what the vegetation now look like. The layers are beginning to emerge. There's complexity, etc., etc. And it has to be curated. You know, this is not. You can't have a maintenance specification for this which says do these 5 things with no feedback loops. You need to have an intelligent human being to make design decisions on that as they manage this. So, you know, that's an interesting thought. And finally, there they are planting the 4th layer, okay, because the 4th layer was planted at the end. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Up next, we're going to hear from Nigel Dunnett. Nigel has recently been noted as one of the top 3 most influential people in the garden and landscape industry in the UK. His high-profile projects, such as the Barbican and this year's incredible Super Bloom at the Tower of London, have brought these nature-first approaches into the mainstream and, let's be honest, our social media as well. This is Nigel. On his last visit, pre-COVID, 2018, bounding along the Blackspur roads, being inspired by our local vegetation. He also left me wondering about Hassell's public liability insurance, should anything happen to one of the world's leading planting designers as he bounded across the streets. So, over to you, Nigel.
Thank you. So as James has explained, there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of technicality, there's a lot of science in what we do. But I think it's also really important to emphasize that this is a profoundly artful thing. It's a profoundly artful thing we do, and that planting design is an art form as well as a science and as well as a very technical thing. And I think particularly the type of planting that we do and that James has described has the potential to reach deep inside to people, to release powerful emotions of joy and uplift and positivity because of the connection to nature, because it's amplified, it's exaggerated, it's enhanced. And I think we all have an innate connection to the wild, everybody, regardless of background, regardless of experience, regardless of where from. And we need to work with that. And I'll talk a little bit later, I think, about how we can do that. But I think the artfulness in the sort of planting we do is the power we have at our fingertips to release these powerful emotions that are in everybody. I think because people now living in cities are often completely disconnected from those natural experiences, we have to work even harder, which is why we work with colour and why we work with this exaggeration. So I think that's a really important point that I feel we have to emphasize again and again. It's a science and it's an art. And I hope certainly when the project here materializes, that is what you will see. I think a lot of what we try and do is creating immersive natural experiences in cities. And my focus has been in taking all these ideas we've worked on and researched, and then both of us applying those for real to make a change, to make a difference. And my focus has been largely in public spaces where people are using them every day. They're not special places people travel large distances to go to or to pay lots of money to see. They're part of the background to everyday life. And I think this idea of immersiveness, it's a bit of a cliche now, but it's a really important way that we experience this type of landscape, because I don't know what you think, but I think the way that we often experience more traditional planting in gardens and parks is a very low energy one. It's a very passive one, because we might have lawns or hard surface or terraces or whatever, and we've got planting beds, and we kind of stand back and look at them. We're observers, and we say, oh yeah, I like that, I don't like that. But it's a very low energy experience. And I think a lot of what we do, and people in this naturalistic planting world do, is create immersive experiences which are high energy. They're very active. You're part of it. You're enclosed by it. You're surrounded by it. And it's not just what you see, it's what you feel, it's what you smell, it's all the other life that's flying around you. It's a high energy experience, and I think that's a real big difference with this sort of approach. So we have this power to reach inside people, to release these strong emotions, but we also have another power with what we do, and that's the power to cool down overheated cities, to dry out flooded cities, to clean up polluted cities, to bring life to lifeless places. And we can do it in a way that's beautiful and amazing. And the crucial thing, I think, that we bring to this is that we do all these things, but we do it in a way that people love, that people really like. And not just like, that people say, I want to have more of that. Why can't we have that? Why can't that be here? So I think, one of the big things that we've worked on is to take a people-first approach to urban greening and to environmental sustainability. Because if it's not going to work for people, it's not going to work for everything else. It's not going to be sustainable in the long term. So the aesthetics, the visual, the experiential elements were as important as the biodiversity and all the other environmental benefits. So I think I've kind of come to see it really as a mission to infiltrate transformational nature everywhere through what we do. And why do I say this? Well, I think the time for playing around at the edges with what we do is gone. Having a green roof over there, or a bit of meadow over there, or a rain garden down there, that's fine. It'll have kind of small-scale localized effects, but that's all they will be. Now we have to do this on a big scale, we have to do it on a large scale, and we have to connect it all up. And that's why I say it has to be transformational. It has to change the way places look and the way places operate. We can't work at the small scale with limited thinking anymore. And that's challenging. Because I think when we do apply our ideas on a large scale, it does change places. It changes how places look, often completely. It changes how places are experienced. It changes how they're used. I think crucially it changes who uses them. It brings in whole new audiences and whole new users to places. And that's not just humans, it's non-human users as well. And it changes how places are maintained and managed. And like I said, that is hugely challenging to all involved. So what I want to do is take us quickly through 4 projects and maybe explain some of those transformations and some of those lessons learned. And I'll take a look at the Sheffield Greater Green, the Barbican in London, briefly at Battersea Power Station, and then finish off with the Tower of London Superbloom. So we'll run quickly through these 4 projects. I'm not going to explain them in great detail. The Greater Green scheme, very imaginatively termed Greater Green, is the UK's largest or longest green street. It's 1.5 kilometres of urban greening, and it involved the conversion of what you see here, an inner city highway, dominated from building to building on each side by road surface and sidewalks, and the conversion of that into a multifunctional greenway. And this is an early visual. I think pretty much the figure in terms of greening is 60% of the total area that was previously totally hard surface. 60% of that now is green, it's planting. It's not just any old green, it's high quality, beautiful, urban street gardens, and they're connected and they're continuous. So this is a visual produced, I think, in 2014, and this is how it looks now. And it's been done in 2 phases, and it's actually ongoing, but the first phase was 2016, the second phase finished in 2020, and there's more and more coming into the future. I think having a look at this image here, there is kind of planting after planting after planting into the distance. It builds up. It's not continuous because there are cycleways, there are footpaths, there's pedestrian routes, there's vehicle roadways, and these are lovely photos taken by a British garden photographer, Richard Bloom, who took them in June and July of this year. And these extensive areas of high-quality urban planting provide the context and the framework for city living. They're the background through which people move, or they cycle, or they drive. And just taking a little closer look, there's a rhythmical repetition of elements that you can see through here. These have been designed to look good pretty much every day of the year, because they're not somewhere like a garden you can choose to ignore if it's not looking good. These do have to look good pretty much all the time. And although I was closely involved with these, when I look at these images, I can hardly believe it, because, you know, if you went to, in a UK context, the most famous National Trust gardens or the most carefully manicured gardens, you'd be hard-pressed to find planting of this sort of quality. And yet this is on the street, maintained by the city in a public landscape with public landscape budgets and also public landscape maintenance standards, although it's a little bit special because there's a 3-year more intensive establishment period, but then after that it's maintained under normal local authority conditions. Looking through here, this stretch here, 4 years ago, was covered in buses and lorries and trucks and little sidewalks, and it was a horrible experience for people to walk along. That's all out of there. And really, I think there's a build-up of the experience as you move through this. I think one of the things that's really important about this sort of planting, this sort of landscape, is that it's legible, it's understandable, it's not a chaotic mix of stuff that's all thrown together. And I took these photos about 8 weeks ago in October, and at the time, the upright grass, Calamagrostis Carl Forster, is rhythmically appearing throughout. And that's been put in as a sort of winding, meandering spine through the centre of these plantings. I really like the way that this is 3 years old, this planting, and the plants are starting to engulf the seats and almost give you a hug when you sit down amongst it. So in terms of lessons learned or points to take from this, of this transformational greening, I'm just going to grab my glass of water down here. We've monitored this extensively, and particularly looking at the native pollinators, wild bees and other pollinators using this route. And I'll whisper it very, very quietly. We've compared it with the closest area of native meadow grassland, which is about 500 meters away. And this greater green street outperforms the native grassland and has huge diversity of pollinating insects. It's cheaper to maintain than the previous engineered infrastructure. The maintenance of the hard surfaces, the roads, the sidewalks, and the drainage system was more expensive than the current green system. And we've done lots of social surveys as well. It's hugely popular with people. So people often say when you propose something like this, oh, it's too complex, it's too complicated, we can't do that. Well, this is under typical city conditions. People say it's too difficult to maintain, we can't afford that. It's cheaper to maintain than the standard hard surface situation. And people love it, and it's really received great acclaim. So that's one example in a street setting. I wanted to mention the Barbican in London because it's almost a kind of twin of the situation where we are now. The Barbican is Europe's largest arts and culture complex. It's also a residential community with 4,000 people living there. And similar to here, is full of brutalist, uncompromising architecture and a rather, shall we say, less than inspiring landscape. The previous landscape was monocultural, just 2 or 3 or 4 plant species used throughout, in big blocks, intensive maintenance, keeping bare soil beneath these plants, a lot of, well, really boring, really dull. But this is all podium, it's all landscape above something, roof gardens. And required a lot of water input to keep it fresh and green. In 2013, I was asked to come in and rethink the planting of this landscape and to reimagine what it could be. And the image you see here now, in the foreground, there are 2 species, so phormium and a grass, as well as the lawn. And this is the transformation to the new planting. There are about 60 different species there. There's no bare soil. It's a complete, tight, closed plant community. And I think you best describe it really as a matrix of tussock grasses. It's formed like a framework within which geophytes, bulbs, and perennials come up as a succession of seasonal highlights throughout the year. These photos are from March, when everything is quite low, but we have hummock forms of euphorbia scattered throughout as a sort of structural element. And then gradually the other plants, as the year progresses, come up around, and those euphorbias, which were prominent earlier in the year, become kind of amalgamated with the taller plants that are growing up, just as James has described, a sequence of layers pushing up through one after the other. I'm not going to go through the whole year here, and I don't know, I realized that this image here is from Claire Takacs, who is my favorite garden photographer. I've got a feeling she might be here. I didn't know that, but I do have the photo credit there, thank goodness. This book from taken from a wonderful book with Noel Kingsbury Wilde that came out earlier this year or last year. I think what you can see here is that there's a build-up from open grassland type communities through to woodland edge, through to woodland, building up into the courtyards here. But looking a little bit closer, there's quite a tight matrix, this framework of the grasses, and then the other plants coming up through. I think the really interesting thing about this is that it's not irrigated. The previous landscape had an irrigation system in it. This doesn't have an irrigation system in it. It's a climate-adapted planting, and it shows a large amount of seasonal change. So as we get into the summer, it ripens off, it dries off, we have the seed heads, and it's a whole different look. Which I find to be equally beautiful, but of course when I mentioned about transformational change being challenging, this is very challenging to traditional managers who really don't necessarily recognize the beauty in this. So we have a succession of flowering plants and seasonal highlights coming through. This is October, November images with asters, which are the last things to flower in this matrix. I think what's really interesting as well is that this colourful wildness, controlled wildness, works really, really well with strong and bold contemporary architecture. I think there's a tendency to think that if there's very naturalistic planting, then it works best in the wilder parts of a landscape or in the more sort of natural areas. But actually, when it's set against really strong architecture, the architecture heightens the naturalness of it, and the naturalness of the planting heightens the strength of the architecture, so it works really, really well in a contemporary setting. And then we get into the winter, and we're really looking at the forms and the structures and the seed heads and so on, but with a lot of wintergreen plants, so there's freshness and greenness in the winter. This landscape transformation has resulted in a 70% reduction in water use compared to the previous. It's not a complete no water use, because we want the things to still live in really dry times. It's actually encouraged the formation of a spontaneous volunteer community gardening group to help look after it. And we're doing a lot of consultation done this summer. Very high public satisfaction. Not 100% satisfaction. It's probably 5% of people really don't like it. I can remember the first few years, whenever I visited, there was one man seemed to track me down each time I visited. And he would always say to me, "You've just ruined this place. You've filled it full of weeds." And you know, not everybody's going to like it, but I think the vast majority do. So I want to mention briefly Battersea Power Station, which opened in October this year. And some of you might recognize this. It's one of the iconic buildings of London, beautiful former power station, which sat derelict for decades. And has recently been renovated as commercial and residential. It's the new head offices of Apple in London. And the original idea for the landscape around was to put water around the power stations, like a bit of a memory of the balancing ponds that would have been there before, but also to create wonderful reflecting pools for the building to come out of. That proved to be too costly and technically difficult, so I was asked to come in and provide a planting scheme around the base of this building, but in a way to try and represent the water through planting, so using a lot of grasses that could move in the wind and create sort of rippling effects. I think what's really interesting about this is these are really huge areas of naturalistic planting in a really public place around a really well-known building. Again, it's a matrix of grasses, really strong, upright grasses that look good in the winter, within which sit wildflowers, native plants, but also geophytes and more structural perennials. And there's a repetition and a rhythm of the planting as we go through. But I think what I take from this is that planting of a wild character, and we were deliberately trying also to kind of recreate the feel of brownfield habitats that you might find spontaneously occurring in abandoned spaces in the city. I think to have this scale of planting around a public space in a really well-known part of London would be unthinkable 5 or 10 years ago, and yet now this is filling that space. And I think it's a measure of how attitudes are changing, how the prominence and the role of planting is coming right to the forefront. I want to finish off by briefly going through the Tower of London Superbloom project, which has just completed its first year. And this was it was originally conceived as a celebration of Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee for this year. Obviously, things turned out a little bit different by the end of it. But I think, again, it's a profound transformation of a space that has remained like this for decades until now. The tower, the fortress, surrounded by the moat, which is where the transformation happened, and the moat of the Tower of London is mown lawn, mown grass, low diversity, and inaccessible to public use. Pretty much what you see there. And although this is a kind of world-recognized building and situation, actually the landscape content is what we find everywhere. Wandering around Melbourne parks over the last few days, it's pretty much this, isn't it? With trees coming out of lawns and little bits of flower bed. Now, in 2014, there was an amazing project in the moat with the poppies, filling the moat with poppies as part of the centenary of the First World War, which attracted crowds, hundreds of thousands of people, weekly to come and see this spectacle. And in 2019, Historic Royal Palaces, who manage this site, started to think about what they might do to commemorate the Platinum Jubilee. And they thought, well, let's make a garden. Let's do something like this, but let's make it living, let's make it real, because although the poppies were spectacular, that was kind of quite easy to do, because these were clay ceramic poppies which were on little stalks. You could put them in the ground, and there you are, job done. The idea of making a living garden, which replicated that sort of feel, was of course a completely more complex thing. So in discussing the concept for this, I referred with Historic Palaces to my experiences in the super bloom in California, Southern California, in 2019, where I was lucky enough to be there at the right time when the most amazing super bloom that's happened really recently occurred, and whole mountains, whole landscapes changing colours with flowers. And this is a really rare thing. You need certain weather conditions to be exactly right over the winter and early spring to encourage the germination of the seeds. And you get these incredible spectacles. And I was there, and I was joined by millions of other people who drove hours and hours to these quite remote places to experience this incredible phenomenon. And when I was there, I just took photos like this. You see, you know, everywhere you walked, people taking photos, people leaving the paths to get in amongst the flowers, people swimming in the flowers, having this experience. Now, you can be very critical of this and say, well, look at all the damage, and you can say, what a superficial experience it is, people going out to have the Instagram moment and then disappearing again. I don't see anything negative in this at all. I see this as hugely optimistic thing and really useful for all of us, because I think, again, it says something about the need that many people have to have these incredible experiences in nature. But when I see things like this, I wonder, why do people have to drive hours to experience something like this? Why do we have to wait every 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years for something like this to happen before we can experience it? Why can't it be something, and also really, why is it only people who can afford to drive out here to see it can experience it? Why can't this be what we have in our own parks? Why can't it be what we have in the backyard? Why can't it be what we have in schools? Why can't it be on the highways? Why can't it be on the streets? Why can't this be the sort of everyday experience that we can give to people through what we do? And I think really what James and I have been doing has been making design superblooms in different ways. And the Olympic Park in London was a prime example of that 10 years ago, using seeding to create these spectacles. For the Superbloom in London, for the Tower of London, I was really also inspired by incredible paintings that Monet did across the River Thames to the Houses of Parliament in 1904. He did about 20 or 30 of these studies in different daylights, different times of the day. Just beautiful blended compositions and the brush strokes coming together to create these overall impressions. And so that really started to make me think about the colours we might use for the moat, because this is really giving a sense of place, but also the idea of using brush strokes to build up layers over time. And so the actual design, the planting design for the moat, was like a three-dimensional impressionist painting through plants. And these rectangles that you see here, as a gridded division of space within the moat, each of those rectangles is a different seed mix, a different color-themed seed mix, and they work like the brush strokes that come together to build up that overall impression. And in terms of the different seed mixes, I worked out 15 different seed mixes, different color-themed seed mixes, which is shown by themselves at the top. But they were designed so that they could all sit together and they could blend into each other, partly through sharing of different colors and the combinations of colors. And each of these pixels, each of these points, is a particular species, a particular flower in the mix. And this is just one of them. And the colors in that pixelated mix are taken directly from the flowers that went into that mix. So I did this 15 times to develop these different blends of colors. So it was a totally organic project, so no chemicals used whatsoever, and also a no-dig project. Because of the archaeology and the heritage, we couldn't cultivate and excavate. So everything was created on top of the existing lawns. They were cut short, and then new soil imported in to form the new landscape. This is not a one-off. This is a permanent transformation. So this was not something that was all brought in and then taken away again. This is a permanent change. Very sandy soil, low fertility. So this is the situation that we had, and then this is the situation earlier this summer, really as things started to flower, as we wild this moat. But it's a colourful wilding, it's a designed wilding. And as the summer came along, the flowers started to fill the space. And maybe as you look through here, you can start to see maybe the blending of the different seed mixes, the different colour mixes across the space as they come together. Just taking us on a tour around the moat as visitors would. And this became a totally immersive experience. Around the edges, as people first came in, it was taking around the edge, but as you started to explore the moat, you were able to follow paths through the flowers until we come out to the end near Tar Ridge, and the colours changed to more pinks and purples. So these are images or photos taken in the summer. By the end of the summer, we have had this year our hottest ever day in London. It's been dry for months and months until September, October. So this photo here was taken 2 weeks before the event closed in the middle of September. And everything ripened off. A lot of the earlier flowering things ripened off. It became seed heads and textures and colour with flowers as well. And I think there was a real lesson from me for this, because it's another transformation, complete transformation, and a very natural transformation. And the site managers, historic royal palaces, were very scared of this, particularly this sort of image, the browning and the textures and the seed hairs. And they thought, well, people aren't going to want to come and see this. This is going too brown. It's going too kind of dead looking. But the reality was, and there are lots of surveys done of people coming through, this was hugely popular. I found myself these colours and these textures of the seed heads to be so beautiful. The lights and the reflections, but having the colour as well. I think that's the crucial thing, the colour and the structure. So very high public acceptance of colourful wildness, and I think that's really what we're doing here. And I think the big lesson from the Tower of London project is that if change could be made in this globally recognised World Heritage Site that you would think would be sacrosanct, if change could be made there, then it can be made anywhere. And it should be made everywhere. So let's get to it.
Hello, oh, there we go. Okay, thank you, Nigel. Thank you, James. As promised, we are overrunning, but I'm not going to apologise for that, given distance travelled, and I'm sure you'd agree it's highly inspirational. It's why we enjoy working with them both. I think it's time to let others speak as well. I mean, speaking of inspiration, I just want to introduce Emma Cutting. Emma is the creator and the steward of the Heart Gardening Project, and we all spent a highly inspirational afternoon yesterday, having a wander around and listening to the stories, and that enthusiasm is a constant inspiration. And I'm going to put you on the spot, and can you maybe explain a little bit about what you've done for the last few years? What have you done? Thank you.
I haven't spoken for a bit. Hang on. Hello, everyone. Okay, what have I done? Well, I've been pretty busy. I've been founding or setting up the Heart Gardening Project, and we're not-for-profit that combines community and science and care to joyfully connect humans to humans and humans to nature and nature to nature. And we're doing that through street gardening. And we're not just, this is about strengthening communities, deepening communities. And through that deepening, that strengthening, we're building communities. And it's not just communities of humans, it's communities of plants and animals. The organisation is pretty young, but we've been pretty busy over the last few years, and we've helped to create over 70 street gardens and talked to over 60 scientists and specialists in many fields of expertise, and planted over 7,000 plants, and I've probably spoken to thousands of people about street gardening around Australia, and we've engaged hundreds of households. And all of that has gone into the design for the Melbourne Pollinator corridor. I won't bang on about that too much. I think I had a 2-minute limit. I think I might be over that now. But as well as the Melbourne Pollinator corridor, we're also looking at encouraging and supporting people to get out and street garden, and what that looks like, and how to manage expectations. Doing that, I suppose, from my thousands of hours of doing street gardening myself, I've definitely come to realise that street gardening is its own type of gardening, and that can help people not only get out but actually stay out there as well, stay street gardening. And also changing legislation around nature strip guidelines, and most councils have these, and most of them are very, very woeful. And I've spent most of the year leading a campaign to change legislation in the city of Port Phillip. We were successful. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I had promised to introduce you as the nature strip lady, hadn't we?
Oh, yeah, because I was just called that in the bathroom.
Called that earlier,
it was
that's
awesome.
right.
It was fantastic. A lady in the bathroom just said, I pulled up my nature strip because of you. I'm like, fantastic. That's awesome. Anyway, so, yeah.
I mean, one of the things that struck me that Nigel said, and I think you touched on it yesterday when we were walking around, was that why should access to nature be the preference for people, those that can afford to drive out into the countryside, or and you certainly touched on one of the reasons that drove you as someone, I think, brought up in the country, and then how do you get access to that within the street?
Absolutely. So I grew up on a farm, so I knew what it was like to have it, and I knew what it was like to not have it when I was very sick for 12 years with chronic fatigue syndrome, and I couldn't move. Like, I couldn't get out of the city. I love where I live in South Melbourne, but it's not full of nature, and that really it really hit home for me. And then also my daughter came along, and I went, I don't want her to grow up thinking that the moonscapes that we have around us are okay. So we're turning the moonscape. So, I mean, the street gardening that we're doing, we're taking the barren pieces of public land, of which there are many. They're different types of land, but there are so many around, and we're turning them into landscapes and into heartscapes.
I think the difference in scale is just, it's very inspirational. We've talked about great projects like the Super Bloom, but then bringing it down to those individual little moments is just as important.
But they add up.
They add up, that's right. I'd like to bring Bree into the conversation. Bree represents the Melbourne Arts Precinct Corporation, MAPCO, as we like to call it. And I just want to touch on, and we've all touched on it a little bit in talking around biodiversity. Just wondered if you could just talk a little bit around how that is being approached at the Arts Precinct and beyond as well.
Sure. I'm also quite excited to be sitting next to him because I've ripped up my nature strip based on the landscape lady as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll show you. So when we think about this precinct, one of the key things that we've been thinking about in terms of how will we know that it's made the impact that we want it to make, it's created the value. We talk about diversity a lot, and that's something we've heard over and over again tonight, and we think about this in the context of creative diversity. How can we be creating experiences and showcasing practices and having people involved in as many creative experiences as possible? We think this about the context of community. So what does it mean to have the most possible diversity of community? How do we start to create collective stewardship for this place, even more so than there now is? But we also think a lot about biodiversity. So we think about radical biodiversity. How do we start to integrate and make welcome and invite in nature into this space? And I think it's something that a lot of us have been thinking about, certainly from pandemic recently. Anyone who's had an experience of Melbourne over the last few years, I think has had a really fundamental understanding about the importance of having nature in our lives and being able to bring biodiversity in. But also because it is, I think, incumbent on us to start thinking about this at all different kinds of scale. When we start to think about this from a climate change perspective, from a health and wellbeing perspective, biodiversity is really kind of indivisible from those things. So we think about this in the context not only of what can be done on this site from some of the conversations that we've had tonight, but also what it looks like at network scale. And I had a really good example of this yesterday. I was reading about something called the buzz stops. Has anyone heard about these? It's a really kind of delightful project where ecologically productive space is being made on bus stop roofs, basically. So they're creating this kind of gorgeous parallel transport corridors that are helping to support kind of biodiversity, which in itself is helping to contribute to a whole range of other supportive natural ecosystems. But it's also just an incredibly lovely project. Like, I would certainly be looking to wait for my bus at one of these bus stops, hopefully an electric bus as well. So we've been thinking about this a lot in terms of what the network approach to this means and what it means to be a really productive and generous member of community, and a member of community that connects at a whole range of different scales, whether that's at kind of precinct scale, street scale, or scale of nature strip, and what that actually means to be, you know, connecting and working with people who are planting on their balconies in South Bank over here, what it means to be working with the cities and the local municipal councils to really start to help to push this groundswell along.
And that word community is worth maybe asking all of you. But let's start with Emma around, because I mean, you're on the ground, you're at the coalface, as you're gardening, you're getting feedback right there. And as Nigel touched on, all the feedback, so someone at the Barbican hasn't been positive. I mean, the majority is. Mm-hmm. But I just wonder if you can talk about some of that feedback you've had from the work you've been doing. I'm interested by positive and negative, actually, around that the word wildness as well.
I would say it is I found that it's a similar percentage to what Nigel was talking about. But the thing that I've realised around street gardening, and it's what you're talking about, is that you cannot please everyone. You just won't. And accepting that is one of the first things you want to do. I think some of the most positive things that have really hit home for me have come from women in public housing that have lived nearby, and they've come up to me and said that what we're doing, it's not just the gardens, it's the fact that we're out there just gently being there in the gardens, around the gardens, makes them feel safer and braver. This, you know, if that gives me the strength to keep going, absolutely. And I think the conversations that are started because of the gardens as well. So it's that flow-on effect from kids, all ages, all backgrounds. And I will also say, when I started street gardening and really kind of went from the 6 to across the road to the Bee Gardens, which is a set of small gardens, that was where it hit me like a sledgehammer, the power of street gardening, which was people would hand me cash, they'd put cards in my letterbox, they would just stop and go, "What are you doing? This is incredible." And it was so full on for me. I went, this is a no-brainer, we have to keep doing this. So that's the positive. I suppose as far as the challenges, they've been immense as well. I would definitely say that it's been really interesting with council. and and that it was starting off as a positive thing. It changed, and it has been very, very difficult, but definitely I think taking the high road, positive press, and just hanging in there it seems to have really turned some things around. And not only with this council, I've been getting feedback from other councils as well. Good feedback about people that want change within council. How can we do this together, kind of thing. So what I've found is the immense challenges that we've been through, and there have been others as well. There's been always some incredible positives, always incredible positives that have come out of it. Whether it's the support that I've gotten that's just stepped up in other areas of the community, it's just been, I know that support will be there. You just don't know where it's going to come from, sometimes.
Well, look, we could probably talk all night, but I think we've got 10 minutes or until someone tells me to stop. I think it might be worth just asking for any questions from out there. I can't really see anything with the lights, but let's start right at the front here. There's a roving mic. There's a couple of roving mics. Yes. Yep. And if it'd be great if we could ask questions rather than statements. Given the time we've got, it would be useful. Thanks.
Hi, my question is related with climate and food security. And I really love your work and what you are doing to make this connection between humans and nature again, because it's something that we have missing. But have you considered edibles in your designs? Because I dream with instead have just parks where people walk the dog, we should have community gardens there. So we should have just community gardens. The city should be a community garden. Do you include in your designs edibles to generate more social justice and thinking in our climate as well and in the whole ecosystem thinking and not in this just man-centered system where we create beautiful gardens that are sometimes mostly for aesthetics?
Ooh, gosh, that's a hard. There's a microphone down there. It should turn on.
What I do consider animals, but generally they're animals which might be
Edibles.
edibles.
Now you're regretting picking up the microphone.
Mostly, I'm not an edible person, because I'm normally working to a brief, what someone wants type thing. I don't know, Nigel, have you ever done any edibles? I mean, I'm very supportive of edibles, and obviously, it's a great thing, but it's just not my particular niche.
There was a point in there that I think relating to a conversation we had earlier around that beauty often and aesthetic often isn't seen as doing good. Do you want, maybe it's just worth touching on that because that was a good conversation earlier.
I'm not sure if I can recall exactly what we're talking about. I think that the thing is that I think what we're doing is working with principles and ideas, not with lists of plants that have to be replicated. And so I hope what we're partly doing is just encouraging people to try things out and to be experimental. And there's absolutely no reason why you can't build the edibles into these layers, more of the forest garden permaculture idea. I think it's just it hasn't really been our focus, but that's because it hasn't been our focus, not because it's not possible.
And okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for beautiful presentations. Really enjoyed seeing that work. And James, I'm a grateful student of yours from 35 years ago.
Oh, no. It's bad for both of us because we both realise how old we are.
And I've had 2 copies of your book. One unfortunately left our office, but found another one online for the princely sum of $1,000 US, I think. So it's still a fantastic bestseller. My question really is about what we expect to see on the NGV, and will it be the moment for a purely Australian demonstration of these principles to arrive in Melbourne?
Well, yeah, I mean, but when you say a purely Australian, do you mean will it be entirely purely native species?
Yeah, is that possible, I wonder?
I think the difficulty is, I mean, you know, the word's been tossed around the office the last few days, you know, and it's mainly come from Jack Semler. So I'm crediting it with her. Her with it, is about this idea of being really agnostic in a way, you know. So I guess what we want to do, we want to try to do all the things that Nigel's been talking about sort of making things really rich, to try to keep that sense of richness every month of the year, if we can, to try and provide as many resources for wildlife, etc., as we can, and to do that, you know, we would like to use as many natives as we can, but we probably would struggle to do all of that purely with natives. So I guess for me it'll be a blended approach. That's how I would see it. And of course what you'll have is you'll have the planting responding to the depth of the substrates we have. So sometimes there'll be much drier communities, and you know you might have dry natives sort of mixed with succulents or cacti, perhaps. You know, this could be an approach. You know, so we're still working it out at the moment. But yeah, I think a melded approach is how how personally I would see it at the moment.
Did you want to?
I'll just say again, and just referring to a term that Jack has brought up, which is the New Australian naturalism, which is a little bit different. I think it's an expression of naturalistic planting in a distinctly Australian way. We haven't really worked out exactly what that will be, but I think it's doing something very, very distinctive. But yes, I think not necessarily very restrictive in terms of geographical origin.
I mean, we're whizzing off tomorrow morning on a road trip to the Western District to look at Wandoo and Whitcliffe and all of these native grassland sites, because I mean, I don't know, many of you know, I was quite instrumental in terms of using grasslands, native grasslands back in the 80s and kicking things off in a design sense. So we want to go there and we want to look. But obviously, you know, we're going to these sites now, and if we went in February, they'd be much more challenging in terms of, you know, how we could use them. So we do need to find ways to actually have people coming in, you know, coming in February, and it's looking sort of really sort of interesting and sort of sassy. So it's we have to be. I know you don't like the word, Nigel. We have to be pragmatic. Because we're dealing with a very broad audience and we need to try to reach out to as many people as we can, type thing. So, thank you for the question.
Do we have any more questions? Okay.
I wonder, you know, when you plant, say, 60 species in a plot, like after, say, 3 years, 6 years, 9 years, how many species do we expect to remain, and, you know, what do you do?
Well, I mean, you know, it's pretty typical in all systems, whether they're natural systems or non-natural systems, to get, you know, what ecologists often refer to as, well, mortality or, you know, the sort of density loss, because that's always a natural consequence of growth. So I guess what we do is we look at the soil conditions we're going to have, and one of the nice things about on a podium landscape or like essentially green roof landscapes is the substrates are normally things like pumice. They're very low nutrient, and so they do allow you to control growth, and therefore you're able to maintain much higher density in a square meter than you could on a good soil. So we cut our cloth accordingly. You know, the reason I was using very, very high diversity on the NET project is we're deliberately using these waste materials on the site, and therefore we can maintain very high diversity. On the same site with a clay topsoil, you would have massive loss of diversity quite quickly. So it depends on the site, really. But one of the things that the project we're talking about, we all know that project's floating in the background, obviously. One of the things about that is it does allow you to demonstrate how to use these small plants, you know, at high densities to create really interesting moments in time, you know, which you couldn't necessarily do on a very fertile topsoil.
It does touch on the subject of spontaneity, I guess, and change. That these landscapes are never finished as well. I guess, is it, Nigel, have you got examples of that where, you're going back to projects regularly?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most...
To that point, obviously, there's a constant change of...
It's the most exciting thing about this type of project in a way, and it's very different to a lot of gardens we're used to in that there's change all the time, from week to week, month to month, year to year, decade to decade. And, the management is about guiding the system rather than always trying to push it back into some sort of static state. And that's exciting, but it's also very challenging, and because, to answer the question, I'm not sure that we might know exactly what it will be in 50 years' time, because, it develops a life of its own. And part of the thing about this is that the gardening, the management is as creative as all the things that are being done at the moment in terms of the original design work. So in my experience, if you just leave things, the diversity goes, and there's a need for regeneration and rejuvenation. But also, as we're in a changing climate, who knows what we'll need in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. So to think that things will stay the same, I think is not probably the right way to think.
Yeah. I think I think we're focused on process as much as product. And obviously, traditionally, a lot of landscape architecture is focused on a product, like it's a consumer durable that you buy and you hold it intact for as long as possible. And the approach that we're interested in is actually where you have this constant change, and that's embraced.
So I think we've got time for one more. I'm getting the nod. Yep. Yes.
Thanks for an amazing, inspiring evening. I wanted to ask James and Nigel, controversially perhaps, if you feel some sense of envy or maybe inspiration from the amazing Emma Cutting and what her style of public gardening achieves in terms of building communities.
It's not controversial at all. Of course, I think in a way this is what has to happen. And it's bottom up. To an extent, what we're involved in is a little bit top down, because it's highly resourced. There's huge teams of people developing this project, and that's the way these things work. That's easy if you've got the money. What's much more difficult is to change the way people act and think and do in their own neighborhoods and in their own environments, and that takes inspiration and energy. And so, absolutely, it is totally inspirational, but it's also highly individualistic, and it's also dependent on individuals. So I think we're looking at two different things, but they're two sides of the same coin. They're just two different ways of doing the same sort of thing, and we need that diversity of approaches to bring about that transformation that I talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same. I think it's in Britain, we've been very keen at a political level on the idea of handing land in a sort of a philosophical sense back to communities, because it was a very attractive way to perhaps reduce resourcing through local government. But it's a really big ask, because a lot of the local community stuff that's successful and is long-term depends incredibly heavily on inspirational people who are driven. And those people are relatively rare. And therefore, you can't run the whole show probably from bottom up. You need to have bottom up, and you need to have more of it, but you need to have enlightened top down too, I think. And then they play off one another. They really do. So perhaps the top down stuff sometimes can open up windows to help people. I don't know what you think, Emma, but.
If I know the question wasn't for me, but I'd like to say that because of these two and their work, they've inspired me to go, okay, that can be done in the UK, surely we can do that here. And how do I do it? I'm just going to give it a go. And so these two, including John as well, their work has been incredibly inspiring to me and what we do.
Thank you. And maybe just as a last word, Bree, is when from the Arts Precinct's perspective, just to be a word on that kind of inspiration from Emma and maybe Nigel and James as well.
Oh, look, I fundamentally agree. I don't think I've got an interesting answer because I'm just in furious agreement. I think when we've been thinking about this project, it is always around how we connect, the top down and the bottom up, and acknowledging that there is a stewardship role that comes with a site and a space of the scale of this. And a lot of the questions that we're asking ourselves are, well, what does that mean in terms of how we can help to support other voices, to elevate other practices, and indeed to make really meaningful connections with things that are happening at the community level, things that happen at kind of a whole range of levels, and indeed then potentially to help spread this much broader than just this area.
Thank you. I think that's probably, are we up to time? Just thank you to Bree, thank you to Emma, Nigel, James, thank you for your time. It's just highly inspirational. This is just the beginning. There'll be much more to come, I'm told. Well, I know there is. Over many, many years. So look forward to sharing it as we move through the project as well. So, and thank you all for coming and showing just the high level of interest. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.